Welcome to the Scientific Sense podcast, where we explore emerging ideas from science, policy, economics, and technology. My name is Gil Eapen. We talk with world's leading academics and experts about their recent research or general areas of topical interest. Scientific Sense is an unstructured conversation with no agenda or preparation. We cover a wide variety of domains where new discoveries are made and new technologies are developed on a daily basis. We are most interested in how new ideas affect society and help educate the world how to pursue a rewarding and enjoyable life rooted in science, logic, and information. We seek knowledge without boundaries or constraints and provide unedited content of conversations with researchers and leaders who love what they do. A companion blog to this podcast can be found at scientificsense.com, and this podcast is available on over a dozen platforms and directly at scientificsense.net. If you have suggestions for topics, guests, and other ideas, please send them to info@scientificsense.com, and I can be reached at gil@eapen.info. Hi, everyone. The format today is a bit different. I have two guests, Doctors Heidi Tworek and Dipayan Ghosh. And as listeners know, we typically talk about emerging research and recent or unpublished papers. Today, we are going to focus on democracy, elections, and the role of media. Before we start, I want to give a shout out to New Zealand and Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern, who had a landslide victory today. This tiny island down under restores my faith in humanity and democracy, as it often does. A country truly deserves the leaders it gets, I believe. Now on to introductions. Heidi, you want to go first?
Sure. So I'm Heidi Tworek. I'm an associate professor of public policy and international history at the University of British Columbia in Vancouver, Canada. And I study the history and public policy of communications and media in Europe and North America and around the world.
Great. Dipayan?
Hi, my name is Dipayan Ghosh. I lead the Digital Platforms and Democracy Project at the Harvard Kennedy School. And very happy to be here today, Gil, and with you, Heidi. Study primarily social media platforms, their business models, and their impact on society.
Great. And so we have two experts, both in terms of history of democracy and history of nations, as well as more modern times, how social media and other things might have affected the functioning of democracy and the outcomes. So Heidi, could you sort of lay out the history a little bit? I don't know, we have over 220 countries worldwide. I don't know what the status of democracy is today. Could you lay out a bit of a history for us?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, we have a lot of places that are monitoring various aspects of democracy, right? Whether it's freedom of the media through NGOs like Freedom House, or others who are academics who are monitoring just what is the status of a democracy, right? Because we often say democracy, but there's actually questions of how robust is that democracy? Is it flawed in certain ways? How easy is it for people to vote? And even within authoritarian systems, you can have competing authoritarianism where there's still an election, but it's incredibly hard for the opposition parties to win. So to give a brief and potted history, since the end of the Cold War, there was a period in the 1990s where democracy seemed to really be on the ascent, where the number of democracies, but also the quality of democracy seemed to be going up in a huge number of places. But we have seen over the last 20 to 25 years, a huge amount of democratic backsliding, something that has happened all around the world in different places, and that has caused a great deal of concern for scholars, because it's not just that countries are no longer democracies. It's that the quality of their democracy is changing, that they are becoming flawed in new ways. And particularly related to media, Freedom House has been documenting for quite a few years that the freedom of media around the world is also consistently decreasing. So that includes attacks on journalists, inability to do their jobs. But I think I would add one other thing, which is also the economics of it are also a threat to democracy, because it undermines the ability to have a whole host of different types of media outlets that are financially robust and can report. So I think we unfortunately are in a period where there's a whole host of reasons to be very concerned about democracy.
Right. Yeah. There is a scale problem, obviously. So if you look at some sort of a democracy index around the world, you see, I mentioned New Zealand, many of the Western European countries is still pretty solid democracies. But this retreat that you talked about appears to have happened in large countries, large democracies. Is there a specific reason for something like that to happen?
So I think we've seen it not just in large countries, but also in some smaller and newer democracies. But before I get into the sort of negative, I would say that you're quite right to point to some places where democracy has actually become more robust in some sense. South Korea would be one of them. Actually, their election in April, which was the first major nationwide election during COVID, they had a turnout of 66%, which was the highest turnout in 28 years. So I think we do see some bright sparks in this landscape. But there are a whole host of reasons why I think democracy is facing problems. They are intertwined and they are complex, to do with immigration, rising inequality, rising populism. And we also need to throw, and Dipayan can talk more about this, social media platforms into the mix, which often, I think, accelerate many of the other trends and discontents within democracy that I've just listed.
Yeah, so that's an area we want to explore. So, Dipayan, you have done a lot of work in this area, and we have seen effects of social media in the US in the last few elections, and it is increasingly a complication or a worry for many policymakers. You want to talk a bit about sort of the status of the I would say the takeover of democracy by social media?
Yeah, I mean, luckily, I don't think social media has completely taken over democracy, but for what it's worth, it has definitely impacted democracy in many ways. Stepping back for a moment, and Heidi is a much more renowned scholar in the area of media regulation, history of media, but we had a traditional media ecosystem that was really well defined by broadcast, radio, traditional print. We over the years had a few technological trends around increasing processing speeds and increasing capacity to store data, and of course the advent of the internet itself as well, which really allowed the rise of dominant new digital platforms that have drawn human citizen attention away from traditional media formats into these new platforms. And what does that mean? It means that it's sucked a bunch of economic activity from the rest of society into these platforms. That's not a good or a bad thing. That's just a scientific thing, if you will, in the sense that this is a instantiation of just the technological base evolving over time, moving us towards social media. And admittedly, what that has meant is that as social media and internet platforms have become more important in the context of our daily lives, they have also impacted democracy, because democracy is everywhere. It's how we consume. It relates to everything in terms of how we consume media and form a.
Yeah,
That is, of course, defined by social media, especially for increasingly for younger people in places like the United States.
Right. Yeah. So I want to rewind time a little bit. Get, maybe for just nostalgic purposes, and some listeners might might appreciate. When I was growing up in South India, I had a shortwave radio, and I spent quite a bit of time listening to BBC. I should admit, mostly for cricket, but sometimes for sometimes for news as well. And so my conception of news is really listening to BBC. And my grandfather, who was a senator in the southern state, also had BBC on all the time. And so that's how I grew up. And nobody listens to radio anymore. Perhaps a podcast is sort of a new version, perhaps, of radio, but it's different. And so Heidi, is there sort of a historical merge of information flowing to people as technology changes, and what are the effects of that?
Yeah, I'm glad you asked that question, because the book that I wrote that was published last year was really all about how new technologies can change politics and economics, and why it is, in particular, what I looked at was why it is that the Germans in the first half of the 20th century became really interested in news, and particularly in the new technology of wireless and radio, to try to change politics and economics and cultural understandings of Germans, both within Germany and around the world. So I think one of the things that's helpful for us when we think about our present moment is to recognize there have obviously been new media technologies in the past, and policymakers, industrialists, journalists, academics have all looked to those technologies and tried to use them to shape politics, economics, and so on. And obviously, I was looking at a particularly fraught period, right, when Germany goes through being democracy and then descends into the horrific Nazi period. But I think there is a lot that can tell us, because it tells us that these fights over what a new technology can do, what it should be, whether it should serve democracy, whether it should be allowed to be global, these are fights that we've had over technologies before. And it pushes us to ask the question of, what is unprecedented about our present moment? And there are certainly things that are unprecedented, but then there are these power struggles that I look at in this book, the ways in which fights over regulation happen, that certainly have happened before with things like radio or even TV, and you go back even further and you get to telegraphy. So I find that to be very helpful in thinking about how to address our current problems, is just to be able to disentangle what's the fight that we keep having about new media technologies, and what are the things that are truly unprecedented about these platforms?
Yeah, so either one of you can respond to this. So do we see a difference between, let's say, Western Europe and, let's say, US, for starters, the way that technology is used and consumed? For example, I don't know too much about this, but in Germany, I believe they have only a few channels on TV, and really the news that they consume is really from maybe one or two channels, and as opposed to, I don't know, 500 channels in the US. So do we have a view as to if there is a significant difference in how technology is used and consumed by people who get news in Western Europe and the US?
I suppose I can tell you that, because I write about Germany amongst other places. So you want to ask about the present, right? So what are we currently?
Yeah.
I mean, we do see I'll just take Germany, because it's the place I've written the most about in Europe. I mean, one of the major differences is obviously that in Germany, as in many places in Europe and Britain, you have public broadcasters, right, like the BBC or their equivalents in Germany, and so that does change the media landscape somewhat when they are quite strong within a media landscape. I would also say that there is significant choice, but that Germany in many ways uses social media somewhat less than in the US, and more traditional channels like newspapers are still somewhat stronger in Germany. But if you look at the trends of where things are going, you could almost see Germany kind of 10 years behind the US on that curve, maybe 5 to 10 years in terms of how many people are using social media and so on. So there's still much higher trust in media institutions, but we do see some fraying of that around the edges, and the use in Germany of many of the same social media platforms, to be honest, that get used in the US, which is, I think, the source of some of the concerns that Europeans have about how those platforms are structured through an American way of viewing a media landscape, and what that does to a somewhat different European way of thinking about how you communicate with publics and how media should function.
Dipayan, do you have a view as to, sort of the difference in how information is internalized by people, by, print or more conventional media like radio or audio in general, and then TV, and then,
I think
yeah.
No, I think I think there's a bit of a delay. I think for sure there are major differences in the way that people consume media, whether it's print versus broadcast versus social media. And of course, there's been a lot of discussion over how social media has a very different kind of psychological impact on users than prior forms. Prior forms are, of course, largely, whether we're talking about the BBC or Deutsche Welle or another outlet, let's say in Western Europe, or a broadcast outlet in the United States or India, are forms of mass media. And social media is slightly different in the sense that there are billions of pieces of content that can be shown to any given person, and the algorithms within the platform determine who the person, who every particular individual user is, what their behavioral profiles are, and predicts what they might like to see. And that in and of itself is a very different process and yields a very different sort of media consumption. And this is why a lot of people talk about how there's this addiction factor when we think about platforms like Facebook and Instagram.
Yeah. So that's a big difference, right? So the ability to customize information in small chunks is what happened last 10, 15, 20 years. So broad, sort of medium, whether it's print or radio, didn't have that capability, right? There is also some, sort of biological effects. When I was at Hewlett Packard Company a long time ago, there was some research that showed that, and Hewlett Packard, as you know, is a big printer maker. There was some research around how much information actually gets into the brain by looking at print as opposed to looking at a computer screen. And it was substantially higher by looking at a print medium. And so this brings the question, and things might have changed as we consume more and more electronic stuff, but it brings to the question that when news is coming to somebody through electronic channels, obviously the customization thing that we will talk about, but also is that person really able to internalize that information effectively is questionable. I don't know if there has been any recent research in this area.
Well, I can tell you what I do in my classes, if that's any help, because I always spend some time before my lecture. So this is obviously, pre-online COVID world. But I did look into that research because I was trying to decide, should my students have laptops or not? Should they be making notes on a laptop or not? And there have been studies within classrooms, right, to see, okay, if students take notes by hand on a piece of paper, do they retain more than if they are taking notes by laptop? And all of the studies that I found the same as your Hewlett Packard study, which is that students, simply by taking notes by hand, actually performed better in the final exam, right? Because it was a more active form of learning. So always in the first lecture, when things used to be in person, I would say, here's all the studies that I know. I'm an academic, so please let me know if there's another study or something that contradicts this. I'm more than happy to change my policy, and obviously I'll accommodate for anybody with issues where they can't write for some reason. But I've never had a student, and I've personally never found a study that contradicts that.
Okay. And so from that, I want to jump into, again, going to that customization question. So, one of the things that we have noted last few years is this disinformation attacks through electronic channels. And the ability to customize, the ability to use artificial intelligence to really understand not only the orientation of the consumer, but also perhaps how many seconds of eye time and brain time you are likely to get from that person, and then designing a pellet, I would say, of disinformation in a very targeted fashion is really a big industry now. It is wars being fought between countries and between companies. And so Dipayan, what is sort of the status quo on this now?
Well, I think the sort of regime that you describe is very much enabled by some of the biggest internet companies out there today, and they very much define the status quo. We saw this particularly in instances like the U.S. election in 2016, and this one where whether you're a foreign disinformation operator or a political campaign or PAC in the United States, let's say, there is tremendous incentive. There's a system that you can take advantage of that through which you can essentially analyze the voting population using all the data that you have at hand. So, for instance, that could be voter records, that could be something like the Cambridge Analytica data dump, or it could be data internal to social media companies. But analyze all the data, start to understand the pockets of voters across the American voting population that might be particularly reactive to your messaging, and then just shower them with that messaging, whether it's conspiracy or disinformation or hateful messaging or even violence inciting, or for that matter, a more positive sort of message. Though, of course, more positive and newsy, truthful messages don't get the same kind of engagement, honestly, as more vicious forms of content. But shower that content on these thin cracks in society and watch as they break. That's the tactic that disinformation operators have understood. They can implement to great success.
Yeah, and if you just sort of look at the last 4 years, do you see this problem? We know that it kind of increased. Is it plateauing or is it sort of accelerating? It's getting out of control.
I think it's accelerating in the following, and I think there are reasons why we can see more activity. And that's not to say that social media companies, internet platforms haven't done anything, but I think we're seeing more activity, and we're seeing more activity because, first of all, there's an example that we can all point to in the case of Russian disinformation operations in 2016, 4 years ago, that facially had success in potentially influencing voters. So there's an example, and with that example, many more bad actors have come to understand how these platforms work, how this process works. And meanwhile, I think the companies in question could have done a lot more. I'm talking about, of course, about the biggest internet companies in the economy in Silicon Valley, and they could have done more. We've seen them align with free speech and not take a position through which they are not going to hold themselves accountable to really do anything about political disinformation, especially when it comes from politicians. And I think that's a core problem, and one that really deserves a close look from the regulatory community. And I think it will receive a close look under the right political circumstances.
Right. Heidi, is there any research around, this is just my intuition, there is some network effects, right? So let's say somebody sets out to, sort of spread disinformation. That disinformation can sort of increase in the population through network effects. And my intuition tells me that if that is true, you might see higher levels of polarization. So essentially, once you are in a channel, then the amount of water coming behind you, so to speak, is going to push you in that direction. You cannot swim against the tide, so to speak, right? So, is there any research around that, both in a contemporary sense or looking at historical?
Yeah, it's a good question. I'm going to divide it into two parts. So the first is the question of how do you get a certain type of information, and then are you in what many people call a filter bubble, right? So you get some information from a certain political direction. Do you then only get served and see that kind of information? So with that, the research is a bit mixed, actually. So while we talk in a lot of sort of popular media about filter bubbles, some of the research seems to indicate that it's actually not as strong as we thought it was, that many people actually do seek out information that isn't necessarily within their comfort zone, though that there are certain segments of the population who don't do that. So I'd say the research is a bit more mixed than the common belief that we're all in filter bubbles. The second part of your question, though, is whether and how the effects of this build up over time, which is quite hard to measure, but I think very important, because we can all think of stories we've read where we're not immediately persuaded by them, right? So the idea that one piece of information or disinformation is going to suddenly totally change everything we thought about the world is unlikely. But cumulative effects over time that shape how we see the world, or we might say shift the Overton window, so the space of discussion, that I think is quite important to contemplate, and particularly this question of how far do people become more and more pushed into hyper-partisan environments. I'd say it's also just thinking about sort of causation rather than correlation, because there are all of these other things that I talked about at the beginning of the podcast going on, right? Like rising inequality, problems with COVID, and so on and so forth, which are bigger political problems. It's sometimes hard to disaggregate how far social media is the cause, but certainly it is happening at the same time. And we do see greater polarization, not just in the US, but also in some other democracies as well. So elections being fought on a more partisan basis. There are obviously counterexamples, but it certainly is a trend that we see in other countries as well, not just the US, and those are countries where the same social media platforms are operating.
Yeah, so it's sort of puzzling in one way. I would have thought that education per capita is increasing. What I mean by education is the level of education that the population has reached. And if that is true, I don't know if it is true, just my intuition, then one would imagine with education comes set of tools to look at data, to look at information and form logical conclusions. But we don't, do we find that in larger populations?
I think maybe what we're speaking to is what is the type of education, right? Because all of the problems that Dipayan pointed to are quite new, and a lot of the ways in which our education systems function was not necessarily to educate people how to deal with information online. The good news is that people who are working in NGOs and elsewhere who are really trying to create tools to help people navigate the online world do actually see significant effects if you give people the tools to be able to understand the online environment. And often in some of those experiments, it's not actually correlated with the amount of education. So for example, there was one experiment, I think it was given to perhaps historians, if I remember rightly, and asked them to assess whether a particular web page was true or not. And so the historians applied their usual techniques, which was you read one page really in depth and sort of analyze it in and of itself. But that's not necessarily the best way to do things online, because you actually really need to cross-check things. So it turned out that those who were more educated didn't have quite the right tools to be able to assess information online. So I think it's a lot about the type of education, but also understanding that while that is one piece of the puzzle, there are so many others, because it's also the question of how much platforms and other parts of the online space are engineered to bypass those sorts of faculties, right? I mean, Daniel Kahneman, the Nobel Prize-winning psychologist, called this our systems 1 and 2, right? Our intuitive systems and our deep thinking systems. So it's a sort of bigger question of how the online environment is structured to bypass those kinds of deep thinking systems to try to get towards our intuitions, which makes it much harder for us to react in a way that does indeed follow more logical thinking. So I think it's a very complex question, and that has a lot to do with the ways platforms are engineered.
Right. Yeah, I will throw this out for debate. I want to get both of your perspectives on it. And so, democracy has had different forms, and Heidi, maybe you can talk a little bit about that. I'm beginning to become a proponent of direct democracy now. With technologies that exist today, you could actually move into, even large democracies could move into direct democracy, where you are really making a choice on policy rather than an intermediary who would make the policy for you. And what we have seen from this large democracy is that intermediation is not really working. And especially in a country like the US with a two-party system, policies don't really fit into a blue bucket and red bucket so nicely. And then you go out and say, I'm going to get a blue guy or a red guy. I don't know, it really is even possible logically. So I'll just throw this out, and I want to get both of your perspectives on it. Dipayan, do you want to go first?
Sure. I mean, I think there are so many different ways that so many different configurations of democratic process that we could imagine, and this ultimate form of direct democracy is a very interesting idea, and has been toyed with, I think, by democracies in the past in different ways. We see some version of it in California, of course. There's this Prop 22 proposal that I've been tracking closely right now, concerning data privacy, and many other ballot initiatives in California as well. But I think it is a very clean and clear way of getting the people to advocate for themselves. Now, of course, what we would hope for is all the conditions necessary to make this kind of process, make this kind of a democratic system fair, secure, safe. But having met those conditions, I see no problem with this. The problem is, of course, that it's very hard to meet all those conditions around, educational level and many others. You could kind of think of many ways that you could gain this sort of a system. One example, for instance, is in one at one level we have direct democracy in districts in the United States, where everyone in a district can determine who they want their representative to be. But of course, that's not the fairest system in many districts. So all that's to say, I think there's so many different configurations of democracy that we can think about, and for various political reasons, we're not necessarily ever going to be able to test them all during our lifetimes. But it's very hard to say what could happen one way or the other.
Right. Heidi,
yeah, so maybe a couple of things. I mean, there are places that are experimenting with this. So Taiwan has a platform called Polis, which is trying to experiment with some of these ideas, right? Having citizens debate and discuss. And it's I think, a very interesting experiment. The other version of this is things like citizens' assemblies and thinking about how to use them potentially online and in other places. So I think there are, as Dipayan said, so many different configurations of democracy potentially that there are lots of ways that we could imagine it running differently. I mean, even the basics of how people vote in different democracies is really quite fundamentally different. And the incentives are so different, whether you have a system of proportional representation or it's popular vote or it's electoral college. We can see the ways that changes democracies. But I think regardless of any of those systems, we also see a deep dissatisfaction with democracy in the way that it's currently functioning. So thinking about how democracy not only needs to be defended, but also reformed to be more responsive to many of the concerns of citizens seems to me a really important question that deserves a lot of discussion.
Right. Yeah, this has been great. We'll take a quick break and we'll come right back and continue the discussion.
This is a Scientific Sense podcast providing unscripted conversations with leading academics and researchers on a variety of topics. If you'd like to sponsor this podcast, please reach out to info@scientificsense.com.
So we are back. So Dipayan, you are in the midst of the U.S. elections. You're spending time in Washington. You were involved in the previous administration at some level. There's there are a lot of concerns around the upcoming U.S. elections. Some of them expressed by the president himself, and some by others. Can you give us sort of a sketch of what you believe is happening and what we can expect in the next 2 weeks?
Well, it's a great question. I think what we're seeing, of course, is that it's very widely reported through many polls that former Vice President Biden has a very strong lead over the president, and I don't think many people expect that to change. There's one debate left. There's question over whether that debate will happen, or even if it's allowed to go forward in physical format, whether the president will test negative by then. So I think there's a lot of question, and the expectation is that going into the election, Biden will be maintaining this very strong lead. I think there are a lot of concerns, though, for supporters of the former vice president that, we have seen another candidate in 2016 go into election night with a strong lead, or at least the month before the election, going into that last month with a strong lead. The WikiLeaks scandal, as well as the Comey letter, and then certain other forms of misinformation and disinformation may have affected that last month. I personally think it affected that last month, and that may have swung the election by the end of that month. And so I think that people are being quite cautious in 2020. In the social media context, more specifically, we are seeing so much consternation over the dominant platforms. Twitter, for instance, has banned all political advertising. It did so a year ago in the lead up to this election. Facebook has not. And I mentioned those two companies only to kind of set these 2 points on the spectrum. There are other companies that either have not done anything around political advertising or have banned political advertising. And there's this spectrum. Google would fall somewhere in the middle, where it has limited micro-targeting options of political advertising. So all that said, I think people are quite concerned that tech companies have not done quite enough. There's too much noise and misinformation in the media environment. and that we need to get it right. And I would look to a few different threads in the context of elections.
Yeah, so Heidi, I want to talk a bit about this negative news dump process. It's a phenomenon that I really didn't follow politics while I was in India, nor here. But if you just rewind time a little bit, you can see at least two major instances: John Kerry and Hillary Clinton in the past. And this, in my view, is an optimization problem, which I'm sure some technology companies are helping both parties to optimally time the dump, so to speak. Have we seen this in other democracies? And if so, what have been the effects of this?
Yeah, I mean, the idea that political campaigns get nasty
Right.
and get strategic has been around for a long time, right? And that you try to optimize. And this used to be trying to figure out exactly when do you send out a story so you can hit before the newspapers are printing the night before they land in the morning, and so on and so forth. So these are of course tactics that have been around within political campaigning for a very long time. And we should remember that even US elections, if we just want to stick with the US, you know, in the 19th century was extremely fraught in a whole host of different ways. So I think it helps us to understand there's lots of continuities there. The question is, what is new about this environment? Who are the new actors who are involved? So in the long history of campaigns, of course, around the world, there's been a lot of attention to, all right, how can we position our candidate to get to the right segment of voters? And unfortunately, this role of negative campaigning has been very clear. And I would say that one thing that's really important to understand is that often what's going on is not necessarily persuading people to vote differently, which is how we often talk about it, but it's actually about mobilizing or demobilizing voters for your party or another party. And this, I think, has been a somewhat concerning development, not just in the US, is the idea that you win by demobilizing people, by persuading people not to vote. And you might want to do that through, robocalls, an example that has happened not just in the US, but also in Canada and other places. But what we might call sort of strategic demobilization of voters as a tactic is, I think, concerning regardless of which democracy that's happening in.
Yeah, that's really interesting point, Heidi. So it is really difficult to change somebody's mind in this highly polarized world. But you can potentially do things that does not allow a person to actually vote. One of it is, like you say, demobilizing, I'm going to just stay home type reaction to a news. And we see more tangible, sort of actions like making sure there aren't enough places where you can drop off the ballot. All sorts of sort of technical ways to reduce the ability of people to vote. Seems like where the battle is today. Dipayan, do you have a view on that?
Well, yeah, I think Heidi's absolutely right that part of this battle is fought in getting people motivated, and we're seeing this on both sides. Where this theme, that is, where town hall this week said that I need everyone, and he was speaking with an African American individual when he said this. I need everyone in this community to vote, and I need your support, and I'm ready to work on your behalf. Meanwhile, President Trump on his side too, I think, has done everything that he can to make sure that the right people vote for him. That's to say that he uses the political messaging to get his base activated, and meanwhile institutes a regime of poll watchers around the country to essentially politically police the polls. Meanwhile, in the social media context as well, we're seeing some activity too. Particularly around a topic that Heidi alluded to, suppression, voter suppression. this is one of the key intersections between targeted political engagement over social media and the electoral process.
Yeah, this idea of poll watching, Heidi. I remember, U.S. used to send, and I know Jimmy Carter was very involved in this, to emerging democracies in developing world, poll watchers to assure that those democracies function. It appears to me that in the U.S. we probably need some poll watchers this time.
Yeah.
what is your sense of where we are today?
Yeah, I mean, we're in a very concerning place. I'm sitting here in British Columbia, where there's currently a provincial election happening. And last week I watched the leaders debate. And directly after the leaders debate was an advertisement informing people how to vote by mail and giving them a sense of how to do it, right? In a completely non-partisan fashion, right? Encouraging people to be able to vote safely, something that we've also seen during the pandemic in many other places around the world, like South Korea, New Zealand, or other Canadian provinces that have also run elections. So I think I just say that to make very clear that it is possible to have free and fair elections during a pandemic. It has been shown by multiple democracies. So there really is no reason why that cannot happen. The pandemic is not an excuse in any way, shape, or form for voter suppression or questioning procedures around, say, mail-in ballots, for example. What we're seeing in the US, though, I think is partly historical. It has to do with the US's long history of various types of strategic voter suppression, including the long history of disenfranchisement of African American voters, something that has now come back to the fore through a whole host of different tools. And those who are experts on other democracies around the world, I think, are deeply concerned because many of the things that they have observed in other countries are now happening more and more prominently within the US. So I think there are lots of reasons to be deeply concerned. And were this another country, as you say, Jimmy Carter's center probably would be sending election observers to see that this election was actually being conducted freely and fairly. So there are a whole host of different historical, contextual, and other factors that run into this. But the question is, how can each sort of component of American society, business, and so on and so forth play their part in trying to make this election as free and fair as possible?
Yeah, so Dipayan, I have to say I'm sort of surprised in 2020 we have this problem. And again, if you think that the population is generally getting more educated, they have better ways to get to information, they have better tools to cross-check, as Heidi mentioned, all of those things exist. The ability to really disenfranchise a group of people by providing them information seems counterintuitive to me. Maybe I'm too naive about it, but we see that happening, right?
Yeah, we do, and I think we have to acknowledge something that Heidi mentioned earlier in the podcast, which is that there are economic disparities in the United States, and they seem to be we seem to be drifting apart further and further across those economic lines, and that drift is also affecting our politics and our society and everything, our culture. And I think all that's to say that there are certain people, certain pockets, certain segments of the voting population today that feel very strongly that something needs to change in Washington. Meanwhile, there are others who feel that no matter what happens in Washington, I am never going to get out of this rut. And I think that's a very powerful, it's the most powerful and politically powerful feeling that one can have that influences what they do in the context of November 3rd. And that's something that no amount of education can really alleviate. That's to say, feeling fully part of the national economy, feeling fully part of a globalized economy, or not, feeling left behind by others in the political elite who are protecting themselves. I think that's the most powerful feeling that is implicitly driving this division across the country, and that extends to disenfranchisement. Disenfranchisement is not simply about telling people that, hey, the election is on November 4th, or hey, other various lies that simply are the only factor in the disenfranchisement of certain voters. No, I think there are often underlying circumstances, economically, socially, politically, that serve as undertones to the decisions people come to that we describe as disenfranchised.
Yeah. So Heidi, the economic disparity that Dipayan talked about, sort of a segregation mechanism. So information-based segregation, economics-based segregation, and there could be other attributes like religion and skin color and so on. So in a segregated society, you could get a cohort of people sort of feeling loss of control. And when that cohort of people get to a critical size, democracy could potentially break, right? So do we have examples of this happening in smaller scales elsewhere?
Yeah, I mean, I think many of the problems that the US is facing are not unique to the US, right? The question of what globalization has done to within country inequalities is something that we also see as a question within Europe, for example, places like Poland, for instance. That was really one of the keenly fought battles over the last 10 years. The same in the UK, right? The debate around Brexit is also very much, I think, tied to these questions. So I think I would say that kind of element is not necessarily unique to the US, although it then plays out in very particular ways because of the history of the US, where we now actually find ourselves in a situation where the wealth disparity between white Americans and African Americans actually appears to be greater now than it was in the 1960s, the iconic era of civil rights. So I think there are lots of ways in which the US actually needs to be in dialogue with a whole host of other countries that are facing exactly the same questions and trying to figure out how to deal with them, how to deal with a world where globalization has brought great wealth to some, but has really increased inequalities within populations, and also particularly other questions like generational inequality that we have seen in many places with rising house prices, that many younger people will definitely not earn as much as their parents, but even more important than that, they don't believe that their lives will be better than their parents. This again is not solely a US question. It's one that we see through multiple countries, but we also see some different approaches those countries are taking through, say, taxation or some other policies that also will have to be international. So the way that I see it is, how do we, like with history, how do we tease out what's unprecedented and what's actually precedented, if I can use that word. So too here, I think some of the problems that we see in the US are not unique to the US. And so it behooves us to try and disentangle that a little bit, because it helps us understand how much of what is happening around even, say, this US election is very particular to the context of the US, and how much of it actually looks quite similar to some of the discontent and problems that we see in other democracies around the world.
If I could briefly add, Gil,
absolutely.
I couldn't agree more with Heidi. This is not a set of problems that is confined to the U.S. In my personal view either. What's happening in the U.S. is it's a circumstance that's defined by this disparity in economic outcomes for people, which can very well and is happening in other parts of the world. But I was just looking earlier today at a journalist friend of mine, April Glazer, who writes for NBC. She's an investigative journalist on social media and democracy, as a matter of fact. And she really interesting and pointed to a question that was asked to Vice President Biden during the town hall this week by a young African American individual, and noted that in referencing that question, noted that voter depression is about really the goal of making people vote feel that there's no reason to vote. Right. Stoking their inaction and apathy, and that's really, I think, driven by this distaste for Washington, D.C. in many camps of the voting population.
Yeah. These inequalities that both of you talked about, when we think about it from a policy perspective, we tend to look at it as a problem that needs to be solved in that context. But I think what you're saying also is that inequalities are threats to democracy. It's a real threat to the system. So, these are not things that you can just think about solving from taxation or wealth redistribution. All of that might be interesting ideas, but more importantly, it actually acts as a threat to democracy. And so from that context, are there policies that or actions that you have thought about, Heidi, that democratic countries today need to at least think about?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a lively debate, and many people who are much more economically minded than I am have put forth, I think, a whole host of solutions on the table. You can think about the runaway success of Thomas Piketty, for example, but there's also Danny Roderick and others who have a whole host of different suggestions. And I'd also throw into the mix Raj Chetty, who's done a huge amount of very big data work trying to figure out what are really the evidence-based solutions we might have to these forms of inequality, to which we could also add that income inequality and wealth inequality in the case of the US and many other places also leads to educational inequality, but particularly in the US because of the way that public education is funded, so that exacerbates many inequalities. So I think that there's no silver bullet, but there are multiple solutions that are being suggested, whether it's different forms of taxation, trying to deal with tax havens in different ways. Other solutions relate to the taxation of companies, not just individuals. How does one prevent some of the ways in which companies may be operating within a jurisdiction but actually not paying taxes within that jurisdiction? There have been suggestions, for example, from Gabriel Zuckman from Berkeley about how to deal with that. So I think there are a whole host of different potential policies that can be enacted. There isn't going to be one silver bullet. But one thing that I would add is that it's really quite astonishing to me now, living in Canada, that I learned a few years ago that actually you're much more likely to achieve what we might think of as the American dream in Canada, which is to say the chance of you moving from the lowest quintile of income to the highest quintile, right? So we think about economic mobility, that's twice as likely to happen in Canada as it is in the United States. So there are places that do have more economic mobility. There are a whole host of reasons for that. There isn't just one reason. So we find ourselves in a situation where there's a lot of work to do.
Yeah. I want to touch on, it's a related topic, and I want to get both of your perspectives on it. So my view is that many of these policy choices are really complex. So I can think about healthcare, education, energy/environment. They are complex from a technical perspective. A famous politician once said, nobody knew healthcare is this complex. Probably did not know much about healthcare, perhaps, but these things are extremely complex technically, as most people know. So you cannot really get policy choices by politically appointed people. You can't have an energy secretary who thinks the world runs only on oil, because that would be a set of bad, energy policies, right? So So what is your view on, we have the Federal Reserve, sort of an independent monetary authority in the US. Should we have independent healthcare, education, and energy authorities who are then tasked with making policies rather than the political infrastructure that does not seem to have the expertise to do so? Heidi?
Yeah. Well, I mean, we do have some of those authorities in a sense, right? Depending on which country you live in, and the US is quite unique in the number of people who are elected or appointed to those types of positions, right? So something like the fact that you can elect judges or fire chiefs, right? Or the head of the CDC is appointed is a quite unusual thing to have within a democracy. And I've been working over the last few months on health communications around COVID. And so I spent a lot of time looking at many different democracies around the world. So I did a report about 9 different democracies, looking at how they communicate around COVID. And so you can see in many of the countries that were most successful and effective, like South Korea, for example, that they have reformed their public health structures after problems with the MERS outbreak in 2015 to really create a stronger CDC. And they do all sorts of things that are quite sort of boring, bureaucratic and institutional, but that go exactly to your question, Gil, about trying to make sure that those sorts of authorities have independence, but also political clout in some way. In British Columbia, where I sit, the chief medical officer is not political, right? So I think there are lots of examples of countries where that's true. Of course, you always have to interface with politicians, but there are a whole host of different ways of structuring those sorts of authorities so that they both have independence and they have some political clout, because you can be independent, but if you can't persuade politicians to do stuff, it might not help you very much.
Right. Yeah, so Dipayan, do you have a view on that?
Well, no, I think Heidi said it. You know, there's so many different things that can be done, and it's, you know, Gil, to go to something you mentioned earlier. We have to try to develop better models that can help us understand how society works today, how understand the exchanges of money and of other you know, information, and try to design policies that are equitable for everyone. The white elephant, of course, is that there's not much incentive for the political class to do that. So what do we really mean here? I think in the end, this is definitely going to take more pressure from advocates, more pressure from people who are downtrodden to put that pressure on major companies, on major politicians, and ask for change, demand change. Without that, it's going to be, you know, no matter how many models we put together, no matter how many policies we might suggest out of academia or wherever it might be, we won't possess sufficient political will to do anything about the situation.
Yeah. I want to touch on the social media aspect one more time. So, Dipayan, you have done a lot of work in this area. We have 6 or so that appear to be monopolies in this arena, in the social media arena. Many of them have over $1 trillion in market cap. They're responsible for almost 1/3 of the total market cap in the S&P 500. All of these are really tangible symptoms that you have market power concentrated in a few companies. But from a regulatory perspective, do we have regulations that are effective? Or if they're effective, is it just a lax implementation regime that we are in that could be changed?
Well, it's a great question, and it goes to what we've been talking about for the past 20 minutes, that there is this economic disparity. Much of it is driven by Silicon Valley. And you know, in a capitalistic economy, you can't expect any company not to try to maximize its profits. And so from that perspective, we can't really have any problem with Facebook or Apple or Google or Amazon, the four companies that were in the any problem with their doing right by themselves, trying to take over markets and trying to expand their impact economically. We can't have any problem with it. But what we would say is that to the extent that that their monopolization of certain sectors is hurting the rest of society, we need to do something about it. And that, I think, is what really has driven this report, what's driven all the advocacy that we have seen. And I do think that there are a few different ways that we could to address what you're asking. There are a few different ways we could think about the competition policy problem. And it's a long conversation, but in the end, I think it'll boil down to, do we want to fundamentally renegotiate the balance of power between companies like Facebook and the rest of society? Do we want to declare that these are essentially natural monopolies and hold them accountable through stringent regulation that's enforced by government regulatory authorities? Or do we want to instead kind of keep the internet as is for the foreseeable future and maybe take certain marginal measures to let's say close down the opportunity for mergers and acquisitions or things like that for these dominant firms? It's going to boil down to that. And yet, there's a whole menu of options from a regulatory perspective that we could try to pursue. Too much to recount.
Yeah. So in conclusion, I want you to make a prediction, not on the election, but the process. And so, are we likely, I'm talking about the US specifically now, are we likely to get a fair and free election? Are we likely to get results that are accepted by the population? And are we likely to get a transfer, if a transfer of power is needed, a transfer of power that you expect of a democracy? Heidi, do you want to go first?
Being trained as a historian teaches you that predicting the future is a fool's game. Many people in 1989 who said the Berlin Wall would never fall. So I think that what I would say is I'm worried. That's one way. I'm worried about how this election will unfold and what a transfer of power could look like. And that worry in and of itself is an extremely concerning sign for a democracy. And it's something that, regardless of outcome, there needs to be a recommitment to figuring out how do we create a democracy where elections do not have the vast majority of experts looking at it, deeply concerned about what might happen.
Dipayan?
Yeah, I agree. I think we need to be wary, and we need to come in with the expectation that while we may have a fair election, there are politicians who often do exactly what they say they will do, and here we have seen that the president seems to be preparing himself for potentially a loss, as the polls very clearly predict right now, and is doing whatever he can to kind of protect his power. And I think in the end we will potentially see some of that, and we have to do whatever we can to prevent that kind of thing from happening. I serve on the National Task Force on Election Crises, and we are constantly thinking about different strategies to push back against the idea that a fair and free election should be challenged by any political faction.
Yeah. It sounds to me that it's a threat to the institutions that have been built up over hundreds of years, and it takes hundreds of years to build up a robust democracy, and you can actually lose it in a minute. And so, yeah, like you say, many people are worried. Hopefully, we'll get a good outcome. This has been great, guys. Thanks so much for spending time with me on a weekend, and good luck with everything that you do.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.